my name is David, and this is D&D History Hub. Welcome to you all. Now, journalists and journalism gets a bad rap these days. It was ever thus, really, except that the heat gets turned up to maximum and for longer now, thanks to social media and the power of the internet. Just the other day, a well-known YouTube site described newspapers as worthless rags and their journalist contributors dirty, dirty smear merchants. Well, here's a confession. I've been a journalist for almost 50 years, working in the UK and in Australia. So in this video, I'm going to give a personal history of journalism in the early 1970s. The training, the work, the experiences, and the mindsets we developed. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a thumbs up like. So, the 21 young people pictured in the thumbnail to this video were students in the one-year practical journalism course at Richmond College, Sheffield in Yorkshire in 1972-73. They include me, third from the right, second row, with the long dark hair and moustache, trying to look like George Harrison and failing. This was the course you had to successfully complete in order to get a job on a newspaper in England in the 1970s. Once you were accepted into a job, you then had to serve a 2 to 3 year apprenticeship on that newspaper. And at the end of that time of on-the-job training, you had to sit for a day-long exam, which, if you passed, made you a fully qualified journalist. In this episode, I want to talk to you about what that training involved and what it was like working as a journalist in that time. It's obvious but worth stressing, I think, that back in the 70s there was no internet, no online journalism, no fake news, no relativistic thinking shaped by postmodernism, no woke, no Twitter, no Facebook, no pylons. Back then, if as a reader you wanted to complain about something, you wrote a letter to the editor, or demanded an apology, or sued for defamation, or all of the above. In the early 70s, our ideas of what constituted the truth were very different. It seemed obviously binary. Something was either right or wrong, factual or invented. It either existed in reality or it didn't. Words bore their traditional dictionary definitions, and our readers, I think, were not looking to be offended by our inherent sexism, racism, or thisism, or thatism, whatever. Cultural sensitivities to race were much less intense, and the current prominence of transgender politics and ideology, stuff like that, it was a thing of the future. There were very much fewer moralistic pressure groups, no bunch of zealots waiting to pounce on you for whatever modern sin or transgression you had unwittingly committed. But there were rules, and if you broke them, you would be punished. I've seen people sacked for making up stories, something that people seem to take for granted that journalists do. Well, if they do, they get found out, and eventually they'll be got rid of. So, in my time, I've been a news reporter, sports reporter, a feature writer, opinion writer, a sub-editor, a chief sub-editor, a section editor, a newspaper editor, and an editor-in-chief of a media group. I've also lectured in journalism at college as well for a few years, and that was very enjoyable. I've also worked on the other side in public relations for a while. By the way, I've also got a couple of university degrees, including a first-class honours in modern history, but I took those degrees in later life, quite a few years after I qualified as a journalist. So, back in 1970s England, once you had successfully completed the practical journalism course and were accepted into a job, you had to serve a 2 or 3 year apprenticeship with that newspaper. The paper had to train you, exposing you to more complex work as time passed, and you became more skilled and competent. In this episode, I want to talk to you about what that training involved and what it was like, subjectively, of course, as working as a journalist in that time. So, I began my studies in journalism in September 1972 at Richmond College, Sheffield. The course itself was authorised by the English National Council for the Training of Journalists and was known as the 1-year pre-entry course in practical journalism. So you needed this qualification to get a job as a trainee reporter. There were other ways in for university graduates, but that wasn't your training finished. You were indentured or apprenticed to a newspaper for 2 to 3 years, and the paper had a duty to progressively train you in all aspects of journalism, and the cadet had the duty to apply themselves, to learn, and to progress to increasingly difficult jobs. At the end of this time, you had to sit a day-long exam, which, if you passed, meant you were a fully trained and qualified journalist with a pretty substantial pay increase. Whatever you might think, whatever impressions you may have of journalists and journalism, it's not an easy job. It can be very complicated and stressful. Deadlines are a fact of life, as is complex and complicated subject matter. And defame someone, you can be sued. And these days, of course, you can be shamed and traduced on social media if you upset the wrong people. I grew up in a lower working class family on a council housing estate, social housing in north of England. My mother was a cleaner, my dad was a sort of odd job man. They always worked and worked hard, but they were unskilled, and we never had much money. I suppose we were poor, I guess. I left school at the age of 16. I did some office work, and I also worked in a factory for a while, packing chocolates, Kit Kats to be precise, and I still dream of rows and rows of Kit Kats marching towards me to pick them up and pack them. Anyway, that's by the way. Eventually I enrolled at what in those days was called a technical college. I started to do a business course, but I hated it, and I dropped out. But I stayed at the college and left with advanced qualifications in English language, English literature, and law. Reading and writing came pretty easily to me. You know, like some folks are really good at maths. I was really good at that stuff. I'm hopeless at maths. I recall attending a careers fair at college and seeing a pamphlet spruiking the careers in journalism. And on the cover of the pamphlet was a bloke wearing a sports jacket and carrying a notebook and pen, and he was watching a house on fire, taking notes. And I thought, I could do that. So I applied for the 1-year course at Sheffield and gained entry to start that along with the other people in September 1972. And they all came from similar backgrounds, or middle class backgrounds, and got good qualifications, O-levels and A-levels as they were known in England. It was an entirely practical course. It taught shorthand and typing, news gathering, news reporting, media law, politics, and some sociology. We didn't discuss any theory. There was no postmodernism, for example, around to complicate things. Words were words. They bore their dictionary meaning. We didn't look for a sexism or racism or imperialism, whatever ism. Words can be tricky, but we looked to be as accurate as we could. And we students were frequently sent out on assignments, perhaps dropped in villages in the Peak District in Derbyshire, told we would be picked up in 2 or 3 hours, in which time we would have had to have found a publishable story. We had experiential visits to a coal mine, to a steelworks, local fire brigade, and other emergency services, and these were really interesting and eye-opening. We were taught how government works, from parish and district councils to national level, and also the law, especially how it relates to newspapers, libel, slander, the reporting of court cases, tribunals, and the like. Simplicity of language and accuracy were hammered into us. The guiding framework, I guess, was who, what, where, when, why, and how. Kipling's honest serving people, but not necessarily in that order. Always double check names and places, ages and addresses, times and dates. Accuracy was prized. Most of us would be going on to work in newspapers in towns and cities where the publication would be the major source of local news and advertising. Get a name wrong, you could lose a reader. Libel someone important, you could lose their business. It was okay to add some spice and drama to your story, if justified, and where applicable. If it's sin, put it in, was the watchword, especially with scandalous court cases where accurate reporting of what was alleged or denied was actually protected by law, so you could get away with quite a lot. I graduated from the practical journalism course in June 1973, and not long afterwards I got my first journalism job as a very junior reporter on the then bi-weekly Gainsborough News. It's a small town in the midst of vast farmlands straddling the River Trent in Lincolnshire. It was a great thrill to be employed by an actual newspaper, a cub reporter, but it wasn't the Washington Post, and I wasn't Woodward or Bernstein either, the Watergate guys. The first thing I had to get my head around was agricultural shows. I had to report on the sale of bulls, cows, pigs, sheep, goats. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was given a lot of help by the show managers and the farmers, who explained to me what needed reporting on and why. Farmers were gruff, but they were patient and kind when you needed them to tell you something, such as the distinguishing features of a Lincoln long-wool sheep and a Lincoln red cow. This stuff was important to them. You had to get it right. Another round I had was called Club Call. This involved a once-a-week visit to Gainsborough's several working men's clubs, as they were called in those days. Essentially, it's social clubs where you could drink and eat and drink some more and play games such as darts and dominoes. And despite the name, back in the 70s, women were present in those clubs. My job was to find stories of achievement, life passages, anniversaries, birthdays, retirements, that kind of thing. Inevitably, those I interviewed would buy me a drink, a pint of bitter usually, and I was often totally and utterly tanked by the time it was ready to leave, and it would involve a very wobbly and blurry bicycle ride back to the office. It was the survival of the drunkest. I don't drink anymore. I haven't for a long time. I was also introduced to sports reporting, specifically covering games of the local football team, Gainsborough Trinity, who played in the Northern Premier League at the 7th level of English football. I really enjoyed this, and it was fun travelling on the team bus with the players to away games. What I learned from this was it doesn't matter at what level. People take their sport seriously and are committed to it. It means a lot to them. So again, you had to learn the skills necessary to describe the action on the field, identify, the heroes and villains, the winners and the losers. You had to be constantly alert. As anybody knows who follows cricket, for example, as soon as you look away, somebody takes a wicket. You've got to concentrate and be focused. I had imagined myself reporting on the dire conditions of the poverty-stricken and covering some tragic civil war somewhere, firmly on the side of the good guys and deploring violence. My writing, I thought, would be soaring yet simple, poetic, like my heroes Steinbeck and Orwell and Hemingway. I had no idea. I thought writing would be easy, but this wasn't make it up as you go along creative writing. This was relaying factual and sometimes vital information in a clear and concise fashion. Now, after a few months, I moved to a new job on the Yorkshire Evening Press, a daily multi-edition, 6-day-a-week newspaper in New York. Back then it sold about 65,000 copies a day into a city of about 110,000 people. It was a major source of local advertising and even national ads in certain cases. A paper's still there, but it's very different today, more online presence, of course. Paid announcements in births, deaths and marriages and other life events brought in piles of money on top of the display advertising distributed across the paper. I think it's a thing that people often forget. Most newspapers and other media outlets are capitalist enterprises. They need to make a profit in order to pay their staff and to return a benefit to their shareholders. You have to treat your readers with respect, not alienate them. In my first few weeks, I was tasked with writing obituaries of well-known locals who had died, and this is not as easy as it sounds. You have to dig around in the files for info on their lives and surviving relatives, and in certain cases you have to interview relatives and friends. I was also introduced to the rounds, checking with the cops, fire brigade and ambulance services if there had been any incidents overnight, crimes, accidents, fires, that kind of thing. If they were minor, I would write them up. Anything more serious, murder, deaths in accidents, major fires, a more senior reporter would be assigned. So after a month or so of this, I was transferred to the Selby district office where I would work under the guidance of a senior reporter who happened to be a great guy called Dennis Towell. Dennis was a fabulous journalist who taught me the nuts and bolts of reporting. We supplied stories for an associated weekly newspaper, the Gazette and Herald, and also for the Evening Press back in York. Selby was a busy port town on the banks of the River Ouse and was close to some heavy industry regions and coal mines. We covered a lot of industrial disputes back then, as the country was plunged into a 3-day working week as a result of Prime Minister Ted Heath's Conservative government policies and trade union reactions to it. It was a bit of a mess. I hadn't been there long when Dennis told me that an important town personality had died. He'd been a mayor or councillor, something like that, and I should write an obituary about him. So I called his widow to ask if I could come round to talk to her about her late husband's achievements, and she readily agreed. When I arrived at the house, an elderly lady invited me in. She made me a cup of tea. She chatted away as I took notes. Then she said to me, would you like to see him, love? Thinking that she meant a photograph. I said, oh, yeah, I would. So she beckoned me to go with her into an adjoining room. And there was her late husband, resplendent in a smart, dark suit, and lying completely dead in an open coffin. I must admit I was a bit taken back, although it was still common in those days for the deceased to be at home. She said to me, what do you think, David? And not really knowing what to say, I replied, oh, he looks lovely. And she seemed happy with that, and we went back into the other room to resume the interview. And that was my first dead body, but sadly not the last. One of my jobs on a Saturday afternoon was to go through all the forms that had been submitted by couples who were getting married at various churches and registry offices that day. I wrote up the wedding reports on the form, what the bride wore, glowing organza gown or whatever it was, types of flowers, what the bridesmaids wore, that kind of thing. I learned the bread and butter rounds of provincial reporting. First up, pop into the police station to check on the crimes and accidents, usually RTAs, road traffic accidents, fights, robberies, burglaries. I'd check in with the cop at reception and he'd ring through to the designated press detective and invariably say, "The Fourth Estate is here." And it was on to the magistrate's court to cover prosecution of all the kind of lower order offences of burglaries, muggings, thefts, fights, crazy mad drunks, grievous bodily harms, car accidents, etc. Does this have an impact on you as an individual? Well, I think it does. If from 8 a.m. in the morning till 5 or later in the evening you're exposed to all kinds of crime, misery, processions of angry people protesting about something or other, death and more deaths, it's bound to impact you. I think it narrows your view of life. It can seem fundamentally dangerous, risky, malevolent, capricious. Perhaps in the evening there would also be a council meeting, say, dealing with things like development applications, car parking changes, retail shopping regulations, all the things that keep a community ticking over. When I returned to the main York office, I felt much more confident, but there always seemed to be something new I'd never confronted before. And so the journalistic apprenticeship period was structured as a graduated learning experience. You progressed from simple jobs to more complex ones. And in 1976, for example, I covered numerous city council committee meetings dealing with issues such as rates increases, arguments over development applications, the introduction of a trial of bus lanes, buildings, and new roads. I think I've got some. Here I go. There's a cutting. What's this? City bus lanes to go. Industry plans, all this kind of stuff. Councillor K, happy with Bark and Ride. There you have it. And then on Saturday, February the 15th, 1975, when the paper cost 4 pence, I had my first front page lead about a house fire in which an expectant mother dashed twice into a blazing room to rescue 2 young children, and a man in an upstairs room leaped 15 feet to safety from the bedroom window. Now, and that's this story. There we go. There's you can see that. One says to blaze. That was a big story for me back in those days. On the front page. One of my very first bylines appeared on a lengthy feature article I wrote on how North Yorkshire fire brigades coped during a long hot summer of fires, extraordinary for Yorkshire at that time, where there was a sort of average of 12 fires a day. It went up to 67, I think. That's that story, if you can see. It was a long hot summer, and that was my reporting. Other features included a piece on the art of watching cricket in a television shop, the story of a haunted house, and the profile of a water gypsy, a man who had lived on a working river barge for much of his life, ferrying various cargoes from the docks at Hull into York via the river. Who's this guy? I loved meeting people like this. Joe Kirk. He used to lived on his barge by himself, trundling up and down the river, ferrying goods day after day, year after year. Happy as Larry, as far as I could see. I also interviewed an old man who was retiring from his job as a bell ringer at an ancient church, which I loved. So I did a haunted house as a ghost a ghost story, things going bump in the night, as an old faded cutting for you. At around this time as well, I began doing film and theatre reviews, which is something I really enjoyed actually for most of my career. It's actually nice to get paid for doing something you like. So in June 1975, I was informed that I had passed the proficiency test in practical journalism by the National Council for the Training of Journalists. At the tender age of 21, I was now a fully qualified journalist. It was the end of the beginning and the progression to a 50-year career. Thank you for listening. And again, if you want to leave a comment, please feel free. I'd love to read your views. And if you want to suggest anything I might cover in terms of journalism, please let me know. Thank you very much. Goodbye.